He just laid the first stone, ready to build his dream pool, when two men in HOA uniforms approached. Their gaze was cold, their tone commanding. "You can't build here." Stunned, he couldn't understand why they thought they had the right to stop him. But what happened next? It turned everything upside down. What came after will shock even those who've seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. It was a bright, sunny morning when I finally decided to start building the pool I had dreamed about for years. After months of planning, the day had arrived to turn my vision into reality. The first stone, heavy in my hand, felt like the beginning of something monumental. But before I could even place it down, two men appeared out of nowhere, stepping onto my property like they owned it. They were dressed in crisp uniforms, the word HOA stitched on their sleeves in white. There was a smugness to their presence that immediately put me on edge. They didn't even greet me. Instead, they stood there, arms crossed, eyeing me with a look that could freeze water. One of them, with a tone that dripped with authority, pointed at the stone in my hand. "You can't build a pool here," he said, his words sharp, almost like a command. I froze, confusion washing over me. Who were these men to dictate what I could or couldn't do on my own property? The audacity. "I'm sorry, but you have no jurisdiction here," I fired back, trying to mask the growing frustration bubbling inside. The last thing I expected was to be confronted like this, especially on my own turf. But they didn't care. Instead of apologizing for the interruption, they started spouting off some vague talk about zoning regulations and neighborhood rules. "You're not allowed to make any changes without approval," the second one added, his voice condescending, like I was some sort of child who needed to be scolded. Something felt off. I could tell they were hiding something, but I couldn't put my finger on it. My mind raced, trying to make sense of this absurd encounter. My heart pounded with a mix of disbelief and anger. Why now? Why me? Why this? The more they spoke, the more uneasy I felt. This wasn't just about a pool. There was something else at play. As the HOA cops stood there, their presence growing more absurd by the second, I began to realize just how little they understood who they were dealing with. The sheer audacity of these imposters marching in here and trying to control what I did with my own property, it was almost laughable. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt a wave of anger wash over me. The nerve of it all. Who did they think they were? I wasn't some average homeowner who would buckle under their intimidation. I was one of the leading contractors in the city. My name was on some of the most impressive projects in town. I'd designed and built pools for some of the wealthiest, most influential people around, and now these two amateurs, these so-called HOA enforcers, were trying to tell me I couldn't build a pool in my own backyard? It felt like a joke. I had handled far bigger and more complex projects than this. Yet here I was, arguing with two buffoons over a basic backyard pool. I wasn't used to this level of disrespect, and it ignited something inside me. I was done playing nice. The more they talked, the clearer it became. They had no idea what they were up against. They weren't just dealing with any homeowner, they were dealing with someone who knew how to get things done. They were about to learn just how wrong they were to challenge me, but I wasn't about to let them see how furious I was, at least not yet. The key now was to keep my cool and play it smart. A cold, calculated anger began to build inside me, a rage I knew I could channel into something much more powerful than just an argument. I would make them regret ever stepping foot on my property, but not with force. No, I would make them regret it by using their own rules, their own tactics. They were going to learn a lesson, and I was going to be the one teaching it. After they left, I couldn't shake the fury building up inside me. How dare they question me? How dare they think they could waltz onto my property and bully me like that? The audacity was beyond anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about principle. No one had the right to push me around in my own space. I spent the entire day stewing,
and I knew I had to do something. I wasn't the kind of person who let things slide, not when my pride and my rights were at stake. So I dug deep into my resources. Every ounce of my experience, my connections, my knowledge, I was going to use it all. It didn't take long to find out who these two clowns really were. They weren't legitimate HOA enforcers, not even close. They were frauds, hired by a small group of so-called neighborhood protectors, people who thought they could impose their will on the entire community. The more I uncovered, the angrier I got. These men, pretending to hold power, were just pawns in a game being played by people who had no right to be meddling in anyone's business. It was beyond abuse of power. It was exploitation. They were using fear and intimidation to control people, to make themselves feel important. And that, I realized, was something I couldn't let slide. I had to turn the tables. I wasn't about to let these frauds get away with it. I knew what needed to be done. The plan was simple but effective. I started gathering evidence piece by piece. I called my lawyer, the one who knew how to handle these kinds of situations. I reached out to witnesses, people who had been harassed, who had seen these imposters try to assert their fake authority. I was preparing to expose them for exactly what they were, charlatans. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about making sure these guys couldn't ruin anyone else's life. I would see to it that they never bothered anyone again. I wasn't going to let a couple of fake enforcers take away my peace of mind, or anyone else's. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than I had expected. After everything I'd uncovered, there was no way I was going to back down. I filed a formal complaint against the so-called HOA cops, armed with all the evidence I had gathered. The local authorities wasted no time in launching an investigation, and it didn't take long for them to uncover the truth. These men had been playing a dangerous game, pretending to enforce HOA rules when they had absolutely no legal authority. They weren't just frauds, they were criminals. It was a victory that felt almost too good to be true. The authorities moved quickly, arresting the imposters and charging them with multiple offenses, including impersonating law enforcement officers. It was a public blow to their egos and a clear message that you couldn't just walk into someone's life and try to dictate how they lived. They thought they could intimidate me, control me, but in the end, they were the ones who ended up behind bars. Standing there in front of my newly built pool, watching the golden hues of the sunset cast long shadows over the water, I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Not just for finishing the project, but for the fight I had won. It wasn't just about the pool. It was about standing my ground, refusing to be pushed around. It was about exposing the truth and making sure no one else would ever be bullied in the same way. The sun setting behind me felt like the perfect metaphor. It marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of something far better. I had restored justice, and I had done it on my own terms. No one could take that from me. No one could take away the satisfaction of reclaiming my space, of showing that truth always rises to the surface, no matter how hard they try to bury it. The victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the quiet peace that came with knowing that I had stood tall and I had won.